World War II tanks, design, armor, and ammunition. World War II would see advances in many areas, and especially tanks would undergo major developments during the war. The use of them was not really well understood by any country, even though some countries had a better understanding what would work than others. Questions like, should it be an infantry support vehicle, heavily armored and slow? Should it be a fast tank like old-style cavalry, light with smaller guns? Should tank engage other tanks? What size of units should the tanks be employed in? And how should they be constructed? Between 1939 to 1945, you would see tanks go from the Panzer II, the Crusader tanks, and the French Somoua S-35 to the M4 Sherman and the Panther tank. How to build a tank. First, you need armor, something that is strong but not brittle. If it is brittle, it will crack, but if it's hard, it will be brittle. So a combination of hardness with something a bit softer would be a good fit. Tank armor can be manufactured in a couple of different ways. The two main ones would be a cast armor or a rolled armor. Both types are actually cast. When casting, you will have some defects, or rather the cast will not have the same property all throughout the material. If you take another step and roll it, compress the armor plates, you will homogenize it and so make the overall strength more uniform. Rolled homogeneous armor will on average be 15% stronger than only a cast armor. Some parts of the tanks, like a turret, might be a good fit to only be cast. Other factors, the steel quality, will influence how good the end armor will be. Cast steel of a higher quality might be stronger than cast and then rolled armor that from the start had a weaker steel. Advantages of only a cast armor is that you can make round shapes, which is good for turrets, for example, and that you cannot really do with rolled armor. A last point regarding armor is that one single piece of armor will perform better than two pieces of the same combined thickness. Spacing those two plates would improve the effectiveness, but then you add extra weight and volume. The next step is how to combine the armor plates into a tank. Well, if you cast the turret, you're more or less done. If you used rolled armor, you will have to attach the pieces together, and then you have some options. You can bolt the plates together, but if you take a hit, the bolt might break apart, and they might send internal pieces flying around inside the tank, killing or injuring the crew. You can rivet the pieces together, but you will have the same problem as bolting the armor. Finally, you could weld the joints, taking away the hazards of parts flying around inside the tank. However, welded joints are still weak points, and the welding itself can add stress to the armor being welded. Most tanks during World War II had parts that were cast, some parts were welded, and some were bolted. Example of riveted tanks during the war was the Hungarian 40M Turan. Some of the Italian tankettes, the L335, had bolted armor. Other tanks like the Panther had welded armor. The M4 Sherman had a combination of welded and cast. Different layouts. If you are not using casting for major parts, you can build a box-like structure, much like most German tanks had at the beginning of the war. Benefits are that this gives good space inside the tank, and it is relatively simple to make. The drawbacks are, of course, that most projectiles will hit the side head-on, good for the projectile, less good for the armor. An alternative is to slope the armor. That has the benefit of forcing the projectile to try and get through more armor, giving added protection. You, however, increase the weight, as the length of sloped armor is longer. But on the other side, you can reduce the armor's thickness, so they usually equals each other out, more or less. The sloping can also deflect or ricochet incoming rounds, which is also an added benefit. The drawbacks are that you have to rethink the inside of the tank to fit all the equipment. And if you do not do a good job, you will increase the size of the tank and so increase the weight, which is not good. In general, sloped armor is a good way to increase the protection with some manageable drawbacks. The Panther tank is a good example of sloping armor. Very sturdy front armor, relatively weak armor on the sides. The M4 Sherman had pretty good sloped armor for its size, and it was a tank that could be produced in bulk and for a reasonable price. The Tiger 1 on the other side had no sloping armor and was still an effective tank from a protection point of view. That tank had other drawbacks, the price and the difficulty in construction being the major ones. A lot of compromises have to be made in tank design, but in general you have to juggle armor versus speed versus armament. The last part are the tracks. They are what makes the tank move through difficult terrain. The tracks are in basic a lot of linked steel sections, making a continuous loop with sprockets or drive wheels to drive them around. The benefit with tracks over wheels are that they disperse the weight over a larger surface. So even if the tank is heavy, it might have a relatively low ground pressure, if the tracks are wide enough. Low ground pressure means that they can move in terrain where wheeled vehicles would get stuck. They can also navigate obstacles better than a wheeled vehicle could. Wider tracks would be better, but that is true up to a point. Most tanks would be transported via railway during World War II, and really heavy tanks like the Tiger 1 and 2 needed such wide tracks that they had to be removed for railway transport and be replaced with transportation tracks. Ammunition, guns and spaced armor. There are some general categories of ammunition. In basic it is high explosive fragmentation ammunition, HE, and armor piercing ammunition, AP. High explosive ammunition does not really need high velocity. In basic it needs enough speed to get to the target. And here bigger is better within reason. A 25mm caliber round will do limited damage, whereas a 105mm caliber round will do considerable damage. Armor piercing ammunition depends on what kind of ammunition it is. It either needs a very high velocity or hardly any velocity at all. Kinetic type of ammunition needs a high speed and a big enough caliber to punch through armor. If a hammer is your imaginary gun, the nail is the projectile, and the surface is the opposing tank armor. A heavy hammer, your caliber, is harder to get up to speed to lift it. A lighter hammer is easier to swing faster, but it is more difficult to push in the nail. The harder the surface, the more force you need to assert to get through. So a heavy caliber is good, but it is much more difficult to get the projectile to move fast enough. Too small caliber and you simply do not have the mass to punch through. Speed, mass and hardness are key for this kind of ammunition to work. And there are several subtypes in this category. Some different ways this kind of ammunition can damage or penetrate armor are: a ductile hole growth. The projectile penetrates the armor and expands the armor around the projectile. Plugging. The projectile hits the armor and forces out a plug from the armor inside the tank. Fragmentation. The projectile hits the armor and fragments the armor inside the tank, sending those pieces around to injure or kill the crew. The second main variant is shaped charged projectiles. In basic, it is an inverted cone with explosives behind it. You detonate the explosives and the cone is pushed forward, creating a jet stream that punches through the armor. The charge needs some distance to form the stream. If it's detonated too late, it will not have time to form the jet, and it will disperse against the armor instead of penetrating it. If detonated too early, it will spend its energy before it can penetrate the armor. This is why you see shaped charges standing on legs or being raised above the target if used stationary, giving the jet time to form. This type only needs enough speed to reach the target. After that, speed does not really play any part in the penetration performance. This is why, for example, the British Infantry Anti-Tank Weapon, or PIAT, was launched by a simple spring. One extra danger for a tank can be found on impact of larger caliber rounds that does not penetrate the armor. It can create something called spalling. That simply means that tiny fragments from inside the armor is knocked off and flies around inside the tank, injuring the crew. Now you might think that bigger guns are better, and up to a point they are. However, they need a bigger turret to house the gun and therefore a bigger tank chassis, which will increase the weight, making the tank less mobile, and it can carry fewer rounds. In general, a longer barrel will propel the projectile faster, as the charge has longer time to act on the projectile. This is why later German tanks would have a 7.5 cm L70 gun with a muzzle velocity of 935 meters per second, compared to earlier 7.5 cm L48 guns, which only had a muzzle velocity of 750 meters per second. L is the caliber multiplied by the number. So a 7.5 cm L70 gun is 75 millimeters times 70, so approximately 5,250 millimeters, or a little bit over 5 meters long. A too long barrel will make the tank front heavy, which is not really good either. So also here there are limits. But as we saw, higher speeds means better armor penetration for kinetic rounds. Spaced armor. You will see some German tanks having spaced armor. In basic, extra thin armor plates protruding away from the side of the tanks. They were called Schützen, which simply means protection. They were not used to combat shaped charged ammunition. They were not really common when they were introduced. Rather, they were used to defeat smaller kinetic rounds by making the round tumble before impacting the main armor, usually to protect the thinner sides of the German tanks. They were rather flimsy, so sometimes the crew simply took them off, or they fell off, or if they were around the tracks, dirt could accumulate against those Schützen. Noteworthy tanks during the war, in no specific order. The Sherman M4 is a must tank to mention, as it had the second spot in numbers produced. A rather well-armed tank with good sloped armor that was cheap to produce. It was by no means a bad tank. The myth about the weakly armored Sherman comes from the fact that the German tanks had very powerful guns. However, unlike any German tanks that mostly went out of history after World War II, even though some Panzer IVs were used by Syria in the 60s, the Israelis would use variants of the Sherman into the 80s and the Chilean army until the end of the 90s, which is pretty impressive. The Tiger I tank, I would suggest, was a failure. It was by no means a bad tank in specifications, heavily armored with a big gun and relatively mobile. It had some good successes, but the few produced, the time it took to produce them, made this tank in my mind a failure. It simply was too complicated for what the German army needed, and it was too heavy to really be able to scour the battlefield at will. Building bridges to carry it would always be a problem, and with some 1300 tanks produced, it was not really worth the effort or the resources. It also had 2 wide tracks transported on railways. You had to change the tracks, which is an extra step. The Panzer IV, I would say, in my opinion, was the best German tank of the war. In the later models with a 7.5 cm gun, it was an effective tank with a weight and punch that made it a good enough tank. In specification, it wasn't the best German tank, but mobility, weight, and with a good 7.5 cm gun, it got the job done. The Panther tank was a good design, but in my mind too heavy, as could be seen in the Korsun-Cherkasy battle. They simply had problems finding bridging material to be able to build a bridge to carry the Panzer tank, whereas the Panzer IV, they had little problems getting it over streams and rivers. The chassis would also see some very effective tank destroyers and other specialized vehicles. Even though in this respect I think that the Panzer III chassis would come out ahead with a very successful Sturmgeschütz 3. Finally, the best tank that came out of that war is the Centurion tank. It's a bit of a wild card, as it did not actually see service during World War II, even though it was in pre-production at the end of the conflict. I would say of all the tanks developed during World War II, this was the best tank. It was well balanced, both in armor and armament. It could be upgraded, and this can be seen from the fact that the tank was in service well into the 90s. In Sweden, it was the main battle tank as late as 1992. It performed very well in conflicts like Korea and the Yom Kippur War of 1973. In my mind, this was the best tank that came out of World War II. So this was my video about tank production, what goes into producing a tank or constructing a tank, and what ammunition is used against them. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give a thumbs up and subscribe, and I hope to see you at my next video.